Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Most college presidents and leadership teams are not economists, but they often make decisions based on data that economists cull and organize for us. We know that having good data can drive good decisions. College athletics is a great example. My guest today is David Hummels. He's a distinguished professor of economics and the dean emeritus at the Daniels School of Business at Purdue. He is also a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has worked as a consultant for and visiting scholar at a wide variety of central banks, development banks, and policy institutes around the world. He has a very engaging Substack site called Finding Equilibrium, Two Economists on Higher Ed's Future. David, welcome to the podcast.
Karen, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this particular issue. I think it's something that higher education professionals have got to spend a lot more time thinking hard about what they want to do. And I come to this, I'm a huge athletics fan. I love college athletics, and yet I'm really troubled with the direction things are heading. And I think it requires a lot more careful thinking about what we should be doing.
I could not agree more. And I think that's what your Substack brings to the conversation is not only do you bring all of your experience as an economist, but you've been a dean, and you also try to utilize, which I think is interesting, AI and Gemini to try to drive some conclusions in your research about where schools are sitting in this teeter-totter of reputation, standard, competitive excellence, those kinds of things. So I'm excited that we're going to be able to talk about that today. One of the first comments you've made, and you have three different Substacks that were done in February and March that were just really spoke to me. You started with this wonderful comment. When the guy in charge of bench presses makes more than the university president, 10 times an average faculty salary, and absorbs the average cost of attendance for 60 students, it might be time to pause and reflect a little on where this is all going. Talk about that comment.
Yeah, I think we've had this sense that athletics spends a lot of money. It's growing in importance. And, schools will do what they feel they need to do to win. But, at the same time that universities are under an incredible amount of budgetary pressure, when they're getting a lot of criticism for rising cost of attendance, for whether or not students are earning a positive return on their investment in college, it seems like the only aspect of the university that is not receiving the same amount of scrutiny is the spending within athletics. And it's not even just the head football coach with these sort of eye-popping 8-figure salaries. It's everything all the way down to the strength and conditioning coach earning $2-3 million a year at some universities. And there's a real sense, I think, when you've stopped being critical of the question, do we really need to pay $3 million a year for someone to teach football players how to do a bench press, that we've really lost the plot on this.
You spent your career at Power 4, Power 5 schools, either as a student or as a professor. What's been your take over the course of that time period? How much has athletics changed since you were a student?
Well, so I was an undergraduate at the University of Colorado in the 1980s. When we went from right before I arrived, we were a horrible football team, and then we suddenly got really good, and student interest exploded, and we were all very excited about it. But there wasn't the kind of money involved at the time, right? There was, the institutional subsidies were modest. The student fees were either non-existent or very, very low. The media rights were very small. And so I think what has happened over that span of time is the scale of things has grown. The difference between the haves and have-nots have grown in a marked way. And, I think people who pay some attention to this might realize that especially in the Power Four conferences, the media rights have gotten enormous. And you might think, and I before I started doing the research on this, I sort of assumed that as these media rights packages were going up into the billions of dollars for the biggest conferences, that would enable universities to sort of retrench and to lower the amount of institutional subsidies to run these programs. But that hasn't happened.
That's right.
They've responded to rising media rights packages by spending even more, taxing their students even more heavily to run these extraordinary athletics programs. So I think that the money involved, and it's not even just the size of the program, it's all the stuff around it. It's private equity getting involved, it's the sports betting, it's all those kinds of things where it feels to me like it's time to ask the question, which of these things is consistent with the mission of a great university?
I could not share your commentary more than if I tried, because I think that we are at that crux. We are at that mission point. We want to decide really what we stand for. Are we athletics and then education? Or are we education first with athletics as a nice complement to what we do? One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I shared these with you in advance because you've done so much analytical research that I want to bring it to the 30,000 foot level for presidents so that they can really understand what the economic data is telling them and what questions to ask. I'm going to start with this first one. What financial test should a university apply to determine whether its athletics program is creating institutional value rather than just simply consuming subsidy? I really like that question.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I'm going to start off a little bit indirectly with
Sure.
my answer to it. So let's just kind of start off with the first piece, right? For boards, they really need to understand how big these subsidies are relative to the overall budget. So if you are in a Power Four conference, the subsidies, either direct institutional subsidies or fees that you charge to students, are around 19-20% of those budgets. But if you go to the Division I schools outside of the Power Four, it's like 70% of the budget.
Right.
Right. So that's kind of the first piece. Those subsidies have tripled in inflation adjusted terms in the last 20 years. And so in light of those facts, I think you have to start by asking the question, what is the mission of your university and what values does it hold? And then you can be very specific about the question, how are athletics advancing that mission? Is it is the only thing we're about with athletics how we're going to improve our conference record, or how do we advance further in the playoffs? If that's what you're focused on, it sidesteps the question of why did we have an athletics program in the first place? Why do we care about that? Once you have that idea more clear, not only in your head, but in some kind of governing document, you can then ask, what is it worth to us? What kind of subsidy should it receive? Now, outside a handful of institutions, athletics doesn't generate a lot of revenue. And so you wind up with the subsidies. Now, that's not inherently a problem, right? There are lots of things that universities do to create institutional value, and a lot of it doesn't generate any direct revenue. The expense is justified by the contribution to the university's mission. But you still want to know whether the value it's generating is proportionate to the amount you're spending on it. So to come back and answer your question much more directly, if you find that your athletics budget has grown enormously, or that the subsidies are absorbing a rising share of university expenditures, you have to ask, has the institutional value that athletics creates for you gone up, or am I just trying to keep up with the Joneses here?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right.
I think far too few governing boards ask the question, what value does this create for us?
And I guess the question I would ask or a student might ask if they were sitting in my class and you were our guest speaker, how do we measure that value? What characteristics should we be looking at that helps us understand what value is?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of ways that you can come at this, right? So there's value to the students involved themselves, the athletes themselves, right? And so we do lots of different things around the university that benefit a subset of our students, right? Now, the challenge is that this is wildly disproportionate to almost anything else that you do. Right. So in a typical Division I school, you're spending about $110,000 per athlete, right, to run the whole program. The subsidy component of that alone might be something on the order like $21,000 per athlete. And so you can say that there's benefits to athletes, and the evidence on this is pretty clear. So participation in intercollegiate athletics generates a lot of value in terms of retention of student athletes, in terms of graduation rates, in terms of placement rates. So clear outcome, positive outcomes there, but very expensive outcomes to purchase, right? I think there are other things that people have talked about in terms of value that athletics programs might generate for the university. Brand exposure, enrollment, fundraising, alumni engagement. So if we have a little bit of time, maybe I could talk about the evidence on each one of those pieces in turn.
We'll get to those in our questions
Okay.
ahead of time, but that's okay. But I think that's a really good point. And when I hear board members talk, they talk in the value of something that doesn't seem measurable. Well, it just helps with our brand. It helps with our exposure. We get free media. If I hear that one more time in March Madness, then look at the value of all the media you're getting because your team's in the tournament. So talk about these, what I call these claimed returns: enrollment, fundraising, brand exposure, alumni engagement. Which of them has the strongest evidence of producing revenue for the university beyond the athletics department?
I like the way you asked that question, because I think there's an awful lot of hand waving around this question of brand exposure, as if, you can sort of like, okay, I don't want to think about this very hard, so I'm going to sort of like appeal to this idea that we have brand exposure.
Yeah.
That you couldn't pay for this. And the answer is actually you can pay for it.
Yeah.
And we do this all the time. It's called earned media. The idea behind earned media is that you can compare the brand exposure that you get through a news story or some event involving your organization that you could have paid for through advertising, right? So you're basically like, what would it have cost me to buy an ad? If you're talking about athletics, for the largest schools that make their way onto prime time, like an ESPN primetime broadcast, or, featured games on March Madness or the college football playoffs, potentially you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. But that's very, very few schools, right? And outside that kind of rarefied air, it's really low value. I mean, a typical school's athletics programs are not broadcast at all, right? And remember, we're not just talking about football and basketball. We're talking about lots and lots of sports here, the vast majority of whom get no media coverage whatsoever. Right. But even if you're talking about a football or basketball team, maybe they're picked up by local radio broadcasts, which you can buy time on a local radio broadcast these days for thousands of dollars, not tens of millions, right? So you can tell exactly how much you would have paid for that, and it's tens of thousands of dollars in most cases, right? But even earned media is only really valuable if it gets you something else you want. And that something could be student applications, it could be fundraising or something. So there's actually quite a bit of research on this question that looks at what the benefits are to not the athletics program, but to the university as a whole from athletics. So I think really the best evidence on this is tied to enrollment. There's kind of a statistical challenge with sorting this out, because big successful universities do everything well kind of simultaneously, right? They have great research and they have great exposure in athletics, and they get a lot of applications. So the studies on this tend to look at surprise wins. So what happens if you won a game people didn't think you were going to win, or you have a big breakthrough event. The kind of canonical example of this is Doug Flutie in Boston College beating the defending champion University of Miami football team on this famous Hail Mary play. And Boston College had this massive increase in applications after that. Closer to where I am, Butler University, in a very surprising fashion, made 2 Final Fours in a row, huge increase in applications. So I think the evidence on that is, if you are a school that has an extremely high profile win that was very surprising, you see a big surge in applications and sometimes in enrollment as well, right? But that's not really a strategy. Like, you can't plan for surprise wins, right? So, and I think when we see this kind of more generally, if you look at the Power Four conferences that have strong athletics programs, they've all seen they've all seen enrollment growth. And the Power Four conferences that have the weakest athletic programs have also seen a lot of enrollment growth, right?
Yeah.
So I think, and conversely, kind of regional public universities are suffering for students, whether they've got good or poor athletics, right? So I think the best evidence on that is the surprise win kind of thing, but that's not a strategy.
And so it does beg the question. I love the data that you just shared with us, that it's about $110,000 per athlete to run in the athletics ecosystem today. And you have to really, when you start to think about how often do those wins come along, if ever, for school, maybe that's one of those touch points where you say to yourself, is it worth paying $110,000 for every one of our athletes? Let's say we have 500 athletes in our program, to capture that one moment, that one piece of lightning in a bottle? Or can that money be redirected to another level of athletics participation, or a different configuration of athletics, or perhaps not even have athletics at all? I know I feel like I'm sacrilegious saying that, but I think that's a question that has to be considered.
I agree with that. I mean, I think the element of this in which athletics takes on a life of its own, and I understand the pressure around this, right? So, as a former dean, I know how seriously some of our most vocal alumni donors take success or lack of success in programs. And I think in some sense, it's a victim. Athletics is a victim of its own success. If just to pick a business school example, let's say the accounting department starts to have really weak outcomes on the CPA test, right?
Okay.
That should be something that would really concern alumni, right? But nobody knows what our CPA pass rate is, right? They know exactly what happened in the fourth quarter against IU.
Yeah.
And somebody dropped a ball, or some coach messed up a timeout, and they get energized around this because of its visibility, right? And so I think in some sense, part of the challenge is the visibility invites a level of scrutiny that is disproportionate to the importance of athletics in the overall mission of the university. Right?
I like the way you phrase that. It overwhelmingly factors into every discussion, it seems, about school. Well, how did your team do this year? It feels like that comes up all the time. So let's flip this conversation for a second and say, when athletics draws on tuition, student fees, central funds that could easily be distributed anywhere else on campus, what student success investments are campuses choosing not to make? And how should leaders evaluate that opportunity cost?
So I really liked this question that you sent me in advance, because I gave us some really significant, like, how do you get your head around this? Because in some sense, you have this challenge that, especially at big complex universities, you have these big budgets. It feels like the money is really fungible across a lot of potential different uses. And so the way I thought about it would be for leaders to compare athletics investments to like investments other places in the university. Okay. So if you're willing to pay $5 or $10 million a year for a football or a basketball coach, what are you willing to pay for your entire history or economics department? Right. I mean, I'll tell you that my institution, our coaches make multiples of entire departments salaries, right? So that's a kind of like to like. What is personnel comparing in this part of the university to this part of the university? If I'm willing to upgrade my locker room or my weight room so athletes have state-of-the-art facilities, what have I done to ensure that my classrooms or my IT systems supporting students are also state-of-the-art? Am I like scrimping on the technology that supports educational programs so I can be sure the football team has the best bench press material available, like, so that you can do a kind of like to like, right? I think if, even more directly, schools increasingly spend a lot of money on tutoring and student success investments for the athletes themselves in order to maintain eligibility. What would other students benefit from similar levels of support and engagement in individualized support and tutoring? I think one of the things that we have pretty good evidence on is the more engaged students are on campus, the more individualized support they get, the more likely we are to retain them, the better they do in terms of grades graduation rates and eventual success, right? I think maybe the single biggest piece of this that I see is Centers for Career Success, right? So
Okay.
I think maybe we see business schools tend to take career services offices really seriously because rankings for business schools take into account student outcomes much more heavily than they do in other kind of colleges and departments around universities. And so you see a lot of attention focused on this question of how are we preparing students for internships, for interviewing? How do we do really effective resume preparation? How do we build experiential learning opportunities so students can bridge from the classroom into to be ready for their first jobs? Athletics departments spend a lot of time and energy on that question.
Yeah.
I know it because we partnered pretty extensively with our athletics department in
Okay.
providing those services for athletes. But I think when you get outside of athletics departments, you get outside of business schools, career preparation is really underinvested in.
Okay.
And it has, I think, a very high return on investment for the typical student.
That's a very interesting observation. I'm really glad you shared that with us because it makes sense when you think about the front porch that are business schools, and many campuses, those are the leading kinds of attraction points to bring students in. It serves the institution well to have a complete cycle of, come in, get ready, and we'll launch you into your career. We do the same thing with athletes, but do we do the same thing in the history department or in the social work? I don't know. So maybe it's a good question for leaders to ask.
Well, so there's a bit of casual empiricism about this. I used as part of being accredited by the AACSB, that's accreditation body for business
Right.
school.
Right.
Teens go around and visit other campuses and they see how services are offered and is part of that accreditation process. And so what I would see would be extremely high quality business services or career services offered for the business students, and the rest of the campus, maybe they could find somebody to help them look at their resume. Right.
Very interesting.
So I think this is an area, and I'll just say I have 3 kids who are now in their late 20s. One of whom went to a business school. 2 of them didn't. They went to really high quality institutions, but the other 2 didn't go through business schools. And the focus on career preparation was dramatically different
It's interesting.
in other fields around the university. And so that's the kind of thing that, in terms of investments that you could make directly in student success, that students care about, their families care about, employers care about, and where you can make a very large difference for a fairly modest sum of money. That's a particular thing. If I were going to spend $10 million at the margin, I'd spend it on that rather than athletics.
Yeah, that's a great example. I really like that. So let's go even further down the rabbit hole with spending. So we've got revenue share, we've got name, image, and likeness, we've got, goodness Lord, the legal and compliance costs that are rising that schools are either funding directly or having reduced from their NCAA distributions. Which institutions then face the greatest risk of an unsustainable athletics model? And what early warning indicators should their boards monitor?
Yeah. So, I think, I have kind of a couple of answers to the first part. Who should be
Yeah.
worried about this?
Yeah.
Like, if you look at the Power Four conferences, they're pulling in an extraordinary increase in media money.
Yeah.
And so you'd think they would be perfectly fine, right? But you're seeing expenditures rise at least as fast as the revenues. And so, what are the risks that they are facing is because they are choosing to make their model unsustainable.
Mhm.
Nobody is making them do this. They are absolutely choosing to spend, in some cases, I was looking at the data on this in a number of Power Four conferences. For a number of these, their budgets, their revenues have gone up 50, 60% in the last 5 years alone. And they responded to that by increasing their spending by 50 or 60% in the last
Right.
5 years alone.
Right.
They don't have to do that. So that's kind of that's sort of my first observation. You don't have to. You're choosing to. Outside of those Power Four conferences, I think there's this sort of element of, they're not seeing the media rights increase nearly at the same rate. And they feel like very quickly they're being left behind. And, and so this choice is even more pronounced because they feel the pressure on spending without the corresponding revenue increases. So really, for the ones who probably where it feels most out of control are those schools that are making this decision. Do we try and compete at the highest levels, or do we just kind of give up?
Yeah.
In
Yes.
terms of warning signs, so I would highlight maybe 4 or 5 things, right? So the first thing is, how rapidly are our subsidies or our overall expenditures rising, either in dollar terms or as a percentage of the budget? And why is that? Like, what is
Okay.
it we're spending on that's so very critical for it to rise so fast? Sort of connected to that, to what extent have we really lost the plot on why we are doing this? Is the only thing we're hoping to achieve by this an increased number of wins? Are we trying to insulate ourselves from angry emails from alumni? And if that's what it is, you got to realize all of this spending results in no greater number of wins and losses and no greater number of championships in the aggregate. It's all zero sum. Like, I can spend more and you can spend more. And at the end of the day, the number of wins and losses stays the same, right? So, so I think I think we should kind of going back to this mission thing.
Yeah.
What is the metric I'm looking at that tells me this was worthwhile, right? Third thing, are we cheating? Right. And I take this, I make this in a very pointed way. Most schools, it appears, or many schools anyway, have decided, even though they stated they were going to abide by the limits on revenue sharing, and they were going to abide by the terms of the NIL deals, you look at the stuff, then the deals that are getting announced publicly, and it seems pretty clear that there's widespread cheating going on. Boards should be asking the question, are we cheating? And if we are cheating, is that consistent with the aims of the university?
Yeah.
Would we tolerate cheating like this in any other aspect of our operations? And if we wouldn't, why are we willing to cheat in order to gain a few more wins on the playing field, right? Fourth thing, are we subjecting athletics to the same tests as our other operations, right?
Mm.
If my dorms or my rec center or my faculty costs were rising at double-digit rates per year, would I shrug and keep paying that? Or would I actually take a hard look at the value I was creating? I mean, I think I know the answer to that. You wouldn't keep paying it. You'd call a stop to it. And I think that the other piece, and just to come back to the zero sum nature of this, universities should be asking, are we getting what we think we're paying for? Right? If I think if I have to, quote unquote, have to pay some coach $5 million a year, am I buying any certainty of success for that investment that I couldn't get if I only paid him $2 million a year? Right. And I think the answer to this is pretty obvious. You look at how many coaches got fired in the middle of the season.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Last year alone in the fall, 15 head football coaches got fired midway through the season, and guaranteed contracts to those coaches amounted to $250 million in severance payments that universities had to pay them. So it's obvious that a mistake was made, either to hire that coach or to guarantee that much money. And this is the kind of mistake that in other contexts at the university would get leadership fired. Right.
Yeah.
And so, it's not the wins and losses that are getting people fired. It's making this stupid decision to guarantee a coach a $50 million or $100 million contract that a year and a half later you decide was a mistake.
Yeah.
So I think there's really got to be a point where universities start to realize they're spending vast sums of money to be wrong repeatedly about where they're spending that money, and then having to make up for it with these severance payments after.
And not to mention some of the off the field behavior that seems to be following some of these high profile coaches around. Just today, the University of North Carolina's $1.5 million a year GM for football was just put on leave, at administrative leave. We don't know why, but that's a pretty high profile position. He's the highest paid GM in the country. And all of a sudden, 2 weeks before preseason starts, he's on leave.
Well,
So,
and I'll tell you what, brand exposure goes two ways, right?
yes, yes,
And as much as I love my alma maters, for the successes that they have had on the playing field, they have gotten black eyes for misconduct,
yeah,
sexual abuse scandals, cheating
yes.
scandals. That it's when you are this high profile and and the news comes out that someone acted in an untoward fashion, that doesn't help.
It doesn't. So, David, as we wrap this up, and you have come with just a load of great information and statistics for leaders to think about. A lot of times we're chasing prestige. These are people we want to be like, our peer or our aspirant institutions. How can we think about athletics differently so that we can possibly even separate our academic aspirations from our athletic aspirations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful. I'm going to come back to where I started.
Yeah.
What are the values of the university? What are the mission of the university? And what role does athletics play in that? I think I'm a big believer in the idea that a university experience is more than just going to classes, collecting credit hours, and
Yeah.
receiving degrees. That a big piece of what we are creating here is a community, an opportunity for student engagement and experience, which looks very different. And I think, it's important to us as university leaders. It's important to the students as well, right? But there are many ways to create community and there's many ways to create value. And we can think about athletics as part of that, but it's not, it is not a substitute for having outstanding academic programs, outstanding research programs, or a great student college experience for everyone else who isn't an intercollegiate athlete. We talked a little bit ago about investments in things like career services.
Yeah.
If I think about the origin of college athletics, it's much closer to what we now practice as intramural sports, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And there's actually quite interesting evidence, a great paper by James Heckman. He's a Nobel laureate in economics, along with some co-authors who studied what it is that athletics participation does for student success. And it's very positive in terms of that effect. But what's really interesting is they found that intramural sports had exactly the same outcomes in
Interesting.
terms of improving student success. And so I would really like universities, in addition to how do we have great programs, how do we have great research outputs, to think holistically about a meaningful student campus experience. And maybe if we quit spending $100,000 per student athlete in order to spend money for other students to have a more complete experience that could involve intramural sports, could involve more robust, music, theater, dance, something like that, where students can be more engaged. We would have a more balanced approach to what is it about our time at the university that makes it special and meaningful and engaging decades later.
Yeah.
I think it's engagement. It's not just we had fun sitting at the football stadium. It was I engaged with people who have similar passions and interests, and they became lifelong friends. And universities need to get back to creating that for a broader set of students.
I think that ties in so nicely with some of the criticism that we've been receiving in higher education in the last few years, that really they're not really getting much value for their degree anymore. At least that's what some people say. And maybe we have lost our track a little bit. But I think trying to get back to not only the value of 4 years, but then how does it translate to the rest of your career, not just financially, but socially, emotionally, those kinds of things as well that colleges can do. And I think you've given presidents and boards a lot to think about. I know you've given a lot to my students to think about. David, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Karen, it's been my pleasure.